Hey everybody, thanks for joining me this week. So hopefully everybody is having a great week, and I appreciate everybody for joining me this week and kind of being part of this journey we're on to learn more about game development. Today's talk is going to be hopefully really great for everybody. This is going to be a talk for game designers, artists, and anybody who's involved in the production of games and everything about game development. Hi, Cassie. Hi, Kushal. Nice to meet everybody. Thank you all for joining. And I wanted to first, let me see here. One thing I forgot to have ready. 1 second here, everybody. Ah, 1 second. All right, sorry about that. I wanted to put a link to this actual document. This is in my Google Drive, and we're going to view it here live. But I wanted you guys to be able to download this or take it home or look it at on your own computer in case you can't. If you're watching today on your mobile phone or a device and you can't see this very well, I'm going to try and keep it as zoomed in as possible. So that we can go through this, but I wanted you guys to be able to review this later or have access to this and stuff there. So please check out the the Google Stream there. The Google Drive link that I put there in the chat. If you're curious to review this document, again later. So first of all, again, welcome. And today what we're going to be talking about is what a pipeline is for a video game. And so what this is going to basically be is kind of a flow chart that I created. This is a real flow chart I created for one of my companies. I created this for a company that I had called Globex Studios back in China. This document's about 10 years old, so it is a little bit old, but it's probably the most comprehensive of any pipeline documents that I've ever created. And because it's for my own company, I'm okay to share it with you guys. Now, it's not normal to always create a document as thorough as this. And so you won't always find something this detailed within a game company. But in this particular case, I decided to create this very detailed pipeline document because I was working in China. I had about 250 people on my team in China. We were building MMORPGs, which are very big in scale, very big in complexity. The vast majority of my team was still pretty junior, and there was English language problems and things like that. So this ultimately was also translated into Chinese, and so this was helping a lot of things. More junior people would know step by step what they were supposed to do. How do you make every asset in the game? How do you make a character? How do you make a level? How do you integrate things together? Where are things in the approval processes? Who's involved in every step? Who's in charge? And makes decisions and all these things. And so I went through and created kind of this very elaborate document. You'll see it's almost 30 pages of a flow chart and a pipeline. And so today what I want to do is we're going to walk you through this whole thing. And please ask questions. If I skip over something or I go too fast, I am going to be blowing through this pretty quickly because 30 slides, as you'll see, this is very dense. There's a lot of steps here, so I can't cover every single step in like super detail, but I think this will be inspirational or informational for anybody, especially if you're thinking about getting into games or whatever, because it's kind of this breakdown of like, how do I get from start to how do I get to finish for kind of every asset, for everything in the game. And so if you go to work for a company and they don't have this, it might be worth creating, but this was a lot of work. It's really hard to break down and document this detailed level of pipelines. I honestly have not seen this level of detail at any company I've ever worked at. So, don't think this is necessarily normal or standard, but it was worth my time because it really helped my team stop making mistakes and ultimately made us a lot more efficient. And just stupid things, you'd be surprised in production what stupid things people will do over and over and over that will like screw up the game. Like, for example, naming conventions. Like, what is an asset named? Or what is an asset, which directory is that asset in? Was that asset checked into source control? These simple like 101 things that just are very rudimentary that like you should know how to do. It's amazing how many people don't know how to do that. How many people don't know how to just remember to like, oh wait, I finished my work, I saved it, and then they went to the next thing and they didn't think about checking it back into the game. They didn't think about notifying the person that was supposed to work on it next that it was ready for them. They didn't know, or they forgot to put it into the right directory or things like that. And then somebody else spends hours trying to find that asset or they didn't like set it up the right way and they forgot to do something. And so this happens a lot on games where people, especially that are a little less technical or whatever, they just don't always remember every step. And so this was a way for me, by building this pipeline document, was a way for me to literally have, for somebody who was more junior or somebody who wasn't sure, to literally have a checklist, and they would go through this whole checklist, and validate their stuff. I'll show you really quick as well. This screen, this was something that I created after the fact. And what we did was basically, took kind of each step, and we'll go through these steps again here in a minute. But I just wanted to show you, I did not finish this document, but we started this document, and the idea for this was for every one of these steps, and so these steps, that are here, these would be the steps in the flow chart, and so the flow chart might only show these steps. However, what I wanted to kind of do was to say, okay, who's involved in these steps? Like, who are the people that are going to be involved in each one of these steps in doing it? And then like how much time, very, 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 very roughly, were these things going to take? And then even what tools and stuff we're doing there. And so, I went through and kind of started this whole process of documenting out all of these things so that, somebody would really understand, okay, like this would take 2 artists and art director. This is 1 artist, and so there was a bunch of this stuff. And again, keep in mind, this was for my project, for this particular team, for an MMORPG, so this is very, 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 very specific to my game. So don't think of these numbers or these breakdowns as being accurate for your project at all. But what's important is that you understand that there was a process here, that there was we went through and tried to figure out, exactly, how long was everything going to be really roughly going to take. And then through the beginnings of the projects, we would try to validate these numbers. So the producers and stuff would try to figure out like, okay, is this really going to be, say, 38 hours of work, and if so, how close were we to these estimates? And we would keep kind of adjusting this so that our scheduling could get more accurate over time. And so these were things that we sort of worked on to kind of try to figure out, what was going to be, the process and the times involved in everything so that we could schedule it. And so this was a tool that the producers were using. But again, these were validated by the games teams. And so let's jump in a little bit so you understand what I'm talking about here for the pipeline first. But I want you to see there was a correlation between an Excel spreadsheet that went with this that talked about the resources and times and the tools that also went through and kind of explained, what these things were. So, and again, everybody, please, ask questions if you've got them, and and I hopefully this will be interesting to everybody. So I created a key first, just to kind of get a sense for what are the different steps, what are the shapes, and what are they supposed to mean. Meaning, like there's a title, there's different steps and sub steps, and and then these shapes here were designed to be things that were for approvals or things that had to be validated. And then if they failed, they could go back. So these were typical. It's a very typical flow chart, right? If you fail, you would go back to some step, and you'd keep doing this loop until it was approved. So let's kind of dive in. Again, we're gonna keep going, and just ask questions if you're not sure about anything throughout this. And so some steps you'll see dotted lines here were optional. And then I tried to, because this document was fairly big and was kind of interdepartmental, I also tried to show that there was things that were coming from previous places and going to places, that were on a different page or part of a different pipeline. So there's a bunch of different pipelines here. I tried to document the number, and the steps here, so that these could be relatable back into the Excel spreadsheets and stuff, so you kind of just knew which step we were talking about. And so just kind of had a simple hierarchy here. So these numbers and letters don't matter for us today. These were just a quick reference thing. And so first of all was kind of this idea of the game universe. Where do we start when we're making a game? Well, one of the biggest places we start is with the universe itself. Like, we need to figure out what the game is, what the IP is, the world building, so to speak, of that thing. And so we wanted to start with this universe. And so, here we're starting with this universe. We are starting, with, kind of understanding, this high level overview of all the zones. And so in an MMORPG, if you don't know, they're not necessarily, the worlds are not necessarily levels. So that in a more traditional game or something like that, the idea of a zone or a level or something like that are all kind of similar. So some of this terminology would be different for your games depending on if you have levels, if you have zones, if you have maps, whatever. Like an open world game or an MMO can be a very, very different thing than a smaller game. So just be aware of some of the terminology. That a zone is really kind of a level or an area or part of a world, and that's what that's talking about. So first of all, creating a text summary. So a game designer is going to go in there and create just in text, in words, what is that thing going to be, right? They're going to work on a little bit of a story. Most of this is all in text, right? They're working on defining who lives there and who's on that level. They're working on defining the enemies, the NPCs, and they're flowcharting out, what kind of the universe is. Like, is there different regions? Like, are they going to create a map of the world? Are they going to flowchart out, where the player is going to go or how the game is going to progress? There's a lot of different flowcharts here that can happen to be built depending on the type of game that you're doing to try to understand, how these things are all related, right? The next thing is writing this high-level story overview for all zones. And, so you're going to work on just that 10,000 foot mile high view, right, of the game and, and of the story. The next thing is creating the visual inspirational concepts. Thank you, Dennis. Glad you're here. And, but don't forget these are recorded. And so if this is a topic that you're, interested in, please check back, when you wake up, and I'm sure this video will be available as well as all my past videos, and all the other mentors videos are available on Twitch and on YouTube, I believe, as a recorded session. So hopefully these help you out, and hopefully you enjoy these. So have a good night, and thanks for stopping by. So, and then in our particular case, because we were dealing with a team in China, we had to translate all the documents. And so for us, this was an important step because, we had designers who worked in English, we had designers who worked in Chinese and Mandarin, and we had to kind of translate in both directions. We actually had a team of, I believe, 6 or 8 in-house translators full time that would just translate documents back and forth between people and teams and emails and things like that. So in a 200 plus person team, we needed to have some people there who facilitated communication and translation when you're working across different cultural boundaries and language boundaries. And keep in mind that some of this process and these pipelines that we're talking about today can be really handy when you're working with art outsource companies. So this may not be just for your own internal team, but if you're going to work with an external company and you're going to bring them on to just say create some characters or create some basic art in your stuff, which we'll get into here in a minute, and we'll show you how those are done. A lot of times those teams, they don't know your engine, they don't know your technology, they're not there on site with you, they don't know what you're doing. And so the more detailed that you are, the more precise you can be, the more exact you are, the better you're going to get results. And so you have to be very aware that these things have to be very detailed when you get into those kinds of things when you're working with external people. And so while some of this process may be a little redundant or a little bit silly for an internal team, it gets more and more important if you have a really large team, and it gets more important if you have a multinational team, or if you're working with outsourced companies and things like that. And so there's times and places where developing a pipeline like this and really documenting it out can really save your butt. And so be aware of that some of these things are really important. And so moving along, then now there's an approval, right? And if I don't get approved, I got to go all the way back up here, and we're going to start over and do some stuff again, right? So this is about, again, defining what the universe is, and then just quick reminders here. Again, these sound redundant. These sounded, stupid to put in here, but it's amazing how many times people didn't do this. Just checking in the documents. Now, this was in an era, again, roughly 10 years ago, when I wrote this, that we had, Microsoft Office, but we did not have Google Documents at that time and be able to work in live real-time documents. So some of this for your team might still be true. Some of this might not be applicable right now. Like if you're using Google Documents, those documents may be live all the time. You may not actually have to check them in. So again, you need to understand what's right for your project, for your team, for your technology, and all those things. And so now they're going to go to defining these global assets. And so the flowcharts here are going to get a little bit more complicated and deeper as we go. And so you can see now we're coming in from that world overview where we were just at, and now we're in this global assets, and we're defining these global assets. And so now we're working to define these global assets, and we've got a whole bunch of stuff here that we're going to be doing. And I made some notes here, because, for example, we wanted all of our assets to be reused really heavily. And so it was important for us to create standards early on, of like, okay, how many characters are we going to have? How many body types are we going to have? How many skeletal types are we going to have? Are we having modular characters, modular vehicles, modular, enemies, like all these kinds of things? Because, again, setting that as a foundation really helped define how much new and original or different things we are allowed to, and how many things we're constrained. And so I wanted to really reinforce that a lot of stuff needs to be reused. We just didn't have the manpower. Even with 200 people, we didn't have the manpower to do, for a game the size of a World of Warcraft MMORPG to just create anything we wanted to create day one. We had a lot of technical limitations. We had a lot of, production limitations, things like that. And so we needed to be clear about those things, from day one. So, trying to set limitations like, how many types of worlds do we have? Do we have a desert world? Do we have a forest world? Do we have, a fantasy world? In this particular game, in this particular case, it was even more important because this game was actually a time travel game. And actually, not only was it time travel, but it went to different universes. And so you could travel through time and to different universes. So this particular game had science fiction, it had fantasy, it had modern day, all mixed in with, a bunch of different stuff that was being put together. And so, it's important that we really structured what, you could do in the game, what you had, the types of architecture. Again, do we have an unlimited number of building types? Or do we build it off like, okay, we got modern day buildings and we've got, fantasy buildings, we have science fiction buildings, and defining these categories of things was really important, and how we were going to share assets, how we're going to share props, sharing enemies and creatures, all this kind of stuff. Creating, starting to create detailed lists and spreadsheets of these things, understanding what's shared in the textures, and animations, LODs, AI, everything, right? So defining all of these things, and again, translating the documents, getting them approved, and then checking in these, these lists. So again, this was a lot of Excel spreadsheet, Microsoft Word type documentation. So next is creating some universal assets. So this is, again, creating stuff that's reusable. These were going to be the things that could get reused from world to world, level to level, region to region, things like that. So recognizing that each world was not 100% unique. Each world was not there. And so we had a structure of the game where each world had its own unique things, but there was also a global set of things that were going to be reused across anything. And that could be weapons, that could be, chests, whatever that was. And so we understood that there was a certain amount that our universe needed for consistency and coherency across all the levels, as well as having the uniqueness for each level. And so that's what these universal assets were doing. And what I tried to show here is that quite often these went into deeper pipelines. And so when you see these things here, we'll get to these pipelines, in a little bit, but we're looking to figure out, okay, how do we find, the features of the assets? Do they have stories, and what are these asset sets, that are there, right? And and then from there, we're going to design these shared object features. And so, again, we'll get into this object pipeline, and we're going to create the base universal assets. And so we'll talk about, specifically like the character pipelines in a minute, and get a little bit deeper into that for anybody that's an artist and really is interested in kind of the art creation pipelines and stuff. This is really designer type stuff, more so, but this is also something that, again, the art team or engineering teams need to be involved in, because this is about everybody defining what's going to be in the game, right? Because, if you go back again to that spreadsheet that we have here, we have a rough idea of how many hours, everything is going to take. And so if we, think about like, a terrain, and maybe it takes 40 hours or 80 hours, just to create the terrain, then, we have to figure out, how many people do we have? How many man hours do we have? Put some buffers in there, and that'll kind of tell us like how many of these things can we have, right? And so we have to kind of limit ourselves day one. And so this planning phase that we're doing right now, in this pre-production phase, is really about trying to guesstimate, the best we can, how much we can do, and how much, where do we save time, where do we save resources, right? And so that's what this pipeline is trying to get across to people. And so again, you're going to create a lot of basic assets, translate the documents. We're going to verify those assets. And this meant putting them into the game engine and actually making them work in the game engine. And that was an important step, in that, to me, nothing is done until it actually is in the game and playable, and I can see it, touch it, and play with it. That's when it's done. And a lot of teammates have this misconception at a lot of companies where when they finish what they do, they're like, oh yeah, it's done. And it's like, no, your job is done. The asset is not done, right? And that asset may have to go through one more step or 100 more steps to get into the game. But it's reinforcing the fact that this is a team effort, and that the word done should not be used until it really is in the game and finished, and stuff. And so, but at some point you still want to verify the assets. You want to make sure that they're there, and that they're usable. And then you want to approve it. And then also we were talking about, revising the list? Do we need to make anything, and revise anything? The next thing is concepting a zone. So remember, a zone is a level, or a zone is a part of the world. And so we're coming in kind of from the concept of that zone into kind of the zone construction. And so, you really want to kind of figure out what is the pipeline for each level, for each zone, for each area, for each world, whatever you call it, for each map, right? However you break that down in your game, each of those needs to be designed and built, right? And so that's what this pipeline is really trying to do, is show you how these things are built, right? And so this was originally, just so you know, this flowchart was originally designed to be interactive. And so this could be something where these were actually even buttons, and people could click on these, and it would take them up to that actual page, and stuff. So that was another thing that these were kind of another reason for having these things here, besides knowing that there's another flowchart that's associated here at a deeper level, was also that these were going to be buttons that allowed people to jump around the map and to get to different parts of the flowchart, faster. So, we first have to concept the zone, which is a no-brainer, right? We need to figure out what that zone is. And then we're going to start, figuring out the construction of the zone assets. And so you'll see that each of these has its own pipelines, and we're going to get deeper into this, as we go. But, as a high-level overview, this is good because you can kind of see, like, okay, to create these zone assets, right? You've got, the basic zone objects. So this could be, anything from trees to, to buildings, whatever that is. These are models that are part of the world, part of the environment. And so when we're talking about objects, that's kind of what we're doing. And this includes their 3D models, includes their textures, and their levels of detail, LODs. And so there's several things here that you're ultimately creating. So these are like the Lego bricks, right? You're right now, this is an artist's job, predominantly, to create these things. These things might need concept art and some other stuff, but this is, again, like a high level overview of it. And then once these things are created, things can kind of move on. Now, some of this stuff can be a little bit in parallel. So for example, you could be creating objects and NPCs or non-player characters all simultaneously. So it depends on how your team is structured. Actually in our particular case, these were two different teams, and they could work simultaneously for the most part on these things. They weren't necessarily codependent on each other. However, the next step, creating a skeleton and skinning, was dependent on this step. So in the NPC construction, you can't create the skeleton and skin it, and you can't animate it until you have the base mesh and the base character, right? And so these are some dependencies, there. And then things like special effects, this is pretty broad. Like, effects could be standalone. They could be things that are like fireworks that go off in the sky, but they could be like a bonfire. Now, something like a bonfire, for example, needs to probably be over a fire pit, right? And so the fire pit might be an object that's created here. And once that object's created here, then at some point an effect, is going to go for it. So, torches or fire pits or things that have fire, these could be things that, a sword that has a flaming sword or magical swords or whatever, so these objects could be created up here. And at some point, you have to attach, some kind of a special effect, on them if that has that available. So again, there is some linearity to how these steps are done. And then ultimately as well, getting into audio and tying in audio. So, if this particular character has unique audio to it, or a particular asset has unique audio. So for example, if you had a chest and the chest opens, and every time it opens, it creaks and, kind of thing. And so, so some of this can be animation, and actually this was kind of a fallacy here. It's NPC animation, but this really is zone animation. And so that could include things like a chest opening, for example, not just a character walking. And then, there might be a special effect. So maybe the chest opens, and so there's an animation that plays. It has a little sparkle effect, like doo-doo-doo-doo, and something cool comes out of it. Think Zelda. Like Zelda's got some cool stuff. Maybe it's some dust or maybe it's little sparkles. And then, there's a little bit of an audio reward and a little bit of ding, kind of thing. And so again, these things can kind of be done simultaneously, but they're also kind of done in sequence to really be better. So, moving right along here, then you're going to work into how you're going to construct the zone gameplay. Again, we're going to dive in deeper here, creating all the zone terrain artwork. Now, a step that I put in here for my particular team was to validate the performance. And so, the problem that a lot of levels have in a lot of games is that they'll go kind of overboard. They think like, oh, I can just throw like so much stuff in this level and I'm going to make the prettiest looking level like you've ever seen, but they don't realize that like at some point you got to put characters in there. You might have to put AI and you might have to put, vehicles, and you might have to put other kinds of gameplay and logic and things that take up memory and CPU and like all these things. Right. And so I've actually seen some super big teams, some super professional teams at really big publisher developers actually make this mistake. I've seen teams work for like several years and they created like all the levels in the game. They built them out 100%. They were polished. They would do fly-throughs of the levels. They were absolutely beautiful, and everybody just went ooh and ah, like, oh my God, this game is going to look incredible. And then they handed them off to like the gameplay programming team. The gameplay programming team throws a couple characters in there, and and next thing you know, the game's running at 5 frames per second, and literally in some cases they didn't know why, and they were trying to figure out like why was the game running so slow, and they eventually figured out it was because the zone, the area of the world was so intensive. It had so many polygons, so much memory, took up so much stuff that there was not room for anything else. And basically, in some cases, that cost the team like a year of time. The teams literally had to go back through this entire process again, and they had to re-optimize. They had to re-optimize everything here in order to pass this zone performance validation. So the zone performance needs to be a memory map that you guys create ahead of time, so that everybody knows roughly how big and whatever can be into how much can you put into a level and still have room for everything else, right? And this can go both ways. This isn't just the level art. Even on games like Munch's Odyssey, when I first was brought into that project, they have a default character, or so the first version of a character, it takes up a certain amount of memory, and I don't remember the exact numbers. I believe it was like maybe 10 megabytes or something like that. That was the model, the texture, the skeleton, the animation, the AI, like all these things. And so that first version of a character was like 5 or 10 megabytes big. And then you could instance that same character, and that would only be maybe 100K. And so it was, the instances were pretty small, but the original, that first version of it was pretty expensive. And they had designed many, many levels that basically had like 10 characters in them. And, that was going to be at 10 megs a piece or whatever. It was just suddenly like there was 100 megs of memory being used on a Xbox that only had 64 megs of total memory, I believe at the time. So anyways, we were like double the memory just in characters. Like that's not counting the world. That's not counting everything else that had to go into the game. That there was so much done. And so we had to literally strip all that out and reduce and kind of say like, okay, guys, you get like 4 characters per level, and that's all you get, right? And that's that's how much memory and how much space you get, and redesign the levels to work with those 4 characters. And so again, this is all part of that zone performance validation as far as how big and how much can everything have. And then music and sound effects is also part of that. Some of this stuff will be part of the big picture world and can be done in zones. So for example, you could have standard music that's maybe just placed throughout a whole level, things like that, or it could be by area. Maybe it's real music that's being played on a speaker in the game and you want it to be localized. So I get close to an enemy base and you hear a bunch of music playing because it's kind of like they're playing it on their loudspeakers or stereo or whatever, in the game. So, again, music and sound effects can be added by level designers, in a big area, but they might also be attached to, like, say, that chest again, a particular object, that when that chest activates or whatever, it plays a sound effect. So there's lots of ways to do that. Now, there's the next level is to focus test these things and to validate these things, right? And so to make sure that, not only did we have these working, but did we find these were fun, to play? And if not, then we got to go back and, and maybe rebuild it and maybe change some stuff, right? And so this was kind of this circular cycle, and very rarely did you get this right the first time. This was usually 3, 4, 5 passes of stuff. Now, it doesn't mean that the music and sound effects need to be changed every time or redone every time, but you might have to be tweaking them or be adjusting them depending on how the levels get rebuilt. And so that's why this is still kind of part of the validation processes. And then once this is kind of done, then you're going to kind of move into this final polishing stage where you're really just adding like better looking art maybe or stuff like that, just anything that's really going to be kind of nitpicky details. And then you're going to work on starting to test and bug test the zones, making sure that you're uploaded to the source control. If you guys don't know, SVN is a source control software that allows you to check in and out files and make sure that they're that nothing accidentally gets deleted. And something else that we did here was that we had 2 different source control systems, and one of those source control systems was for the raw files, and one of them was for the game files. And so quite often this is a mistake that some teams make where an artist, for example, being the easiest to pick on here because they're usually the guiltiest, they might say work in a package like Maya and a package like Photoshop. So let's just say, simple scenario using Maya to create 3D models, and you create Photoshop to create your textures. Well, you go into Maya, you create your 3D model, you save it out. You go into Photoshop, you create your textures, you save those out. Those are usually saved as like PSD files, and your Maya files is saved as a Maya file. They're raw formats because at any time you might have to go back and change those. The problem is that a lot of times artists will just keep those locally on their machine, and then they'll export into a format that the game engine might use. So they might export, for example, a 3D model and a 3D mesh with its textures into a format that's called FBX. And FBX is a format that is more universally used, and then Unreal or Unity can import an FBX file into itself, in order to get that model with its textures on it and have it work. But what happens is those original files, the Maya files and those PSD files, sometimes only stay locally on somebody's computer, and they're locally on one hard drive and only in one place, and they don't get backed up to a server anywhere, and that server's not backed up, and it's not in source control. And a lot of times people don't back up those raw files, and then if that person's computer dies, all you have is the original like FBX, but you don't have the original Maya files, you don't have the original texture files. And so to take that original FBX and re-extract it back into its raw format so that you can like tweak it is hard to impossible. And there's just things like that you need to be aware of, just because if you're not saving those source files, and I've had this happen many times, that can really screw you if a machine dies. You need to change something at the last minute. So that's where, again, when we're talking about here in this particular step of uploading to SVN, what we're really doing is telling people to upload your raw files there, but really everything, but reminding them to don't forget to upload your raw files. And then also backing things up. So I have, in this particular case, I had servers, and everybody had a project folder directory and their own personal directories, and I asked them to back it up to each place. So basically they were on 2 different servers. So basically we were being triple redundant, and that every asset was actually sitting on 3 or 4 places, their local hard drive, 2 different servers, and then the SVN source safe server, and and that kind of guaranteed that like nothing ever got lost, even if one whole system or one whole thing goes down. That didn't happen. So anyways, then going through approving the zone and then completing a particular zone. So that's how the mile high view of how a zone is created. So let's talk a little bit more about the concept of a zone. So this is going back to the first couple stages here. Again, this is going to be more game designer, but again, artists and concept artists especially may be involved in this process. So in this particular case, you're going to be jumping in and designing all of the quests, the enemies, figuring out the asset stuff, figuring out 2D maps, and stuff. I talk a little bit more about some of this stuff in some of my previous live streams about world building. So if you're kind of curious about this particular topic, I do have some deeper videos that talk a little bit more on the particular case of world building in general and how these things, are kind of work, that you can kind of dive into. And so, but basically this is the concept for a level. It then that concept needs to get approved, and then you're going to figure out how long is that thing going to take, and schedule it out. You're going to create then a white box. For those of you who don't know what a white box is, that's creating a very rudimentary, like grayscale or white thing, very rough geometry, that is just going to be something that I can play in and I can run around in it, but it's very indicative of what the gameplay would be like, but it's not going to visually look anything close to what the final game is going to look like. And then the next thing is you start working on the concept art, right? And what's the zone going to look like? And so your concept artists are going to start working here, but again, the designers have kind of predefined what's going to be in those zones and what's going to be there, so the concept artists kind of know what to draw, right? And then you're working on things like with the way this game worked, we had enemies and things that were universal. So those could be on anywhere in the maps, any worlds, any time, anything like that we wanted them to. But we also recognized that there was very unique and specific units that would fit a particular zone. And so those could be civilians. Those could be people that are working at like a bakery or something that are helping you, or a blacksmith that's going to sell you something, a piece of armor or whatever it is. So there was a bunch of stuff for the zone enemies also that were unique, as well as the zone NPCs that were unique that needed to be fleshed out here. And again, translating the stuff and then getting it approved. Putting together asset lists again. So you'll see that there's a lot of common steps in here. We won't keep going over from finalizing the assets and checking them in, that kind of thing, right? So this is about the zone gameplay, and figuring out, again, some of the tasks and durations, figuring out your asset lists, and then figuring out starting to figure out what the core gameplay, really is, right? And this is the literally, pardon the pun, the core of the game. But this really is what the game is all about, right? And so this is basically a level designer who's gone into and is working on building a particular level or a particular zone, and they're gonna basically where do they start, right? And this is basically after the world has been roughly mapped out, right? So they're making the assumption that the 3D maps are basically done, and so then what, right? What do we do, once that's been defined, right? And so one of the first things is placing the scripts and the mobs. For us, a mob was basically an NPC, an enemy, but they were kind of like more swarmer, smaller units that you could kind of fight sort of in bulk. And then the mobs were then you scripted them, you added AI, behaviors, the paths. So where are they going to move in the world? Are they on a fixed patrol path? Do they have an area that they bounce around in randomly, or do they stand still? whatever that is. So again, just trying to understand what they're doing, what their behaviors are. Are they really aggressive? Are they defensive? How is their AI going to kind of function? Was important for us to understand. And then the next thing was creating the quests. So the quests, this was a fairly elaborate pipeline that we'll talk about next, but you need to go in there and figure out what is everybody going to do. And then, it's important that you understand, where is your enemies at first, and where is the important thing so that my quest can either go through those or avoid those, or, know is that going to be, I might need to go from A to B on my quest. And if it's just a straight line, I might go through a really high level area that we know the player is going to die in. So like, do we want that quest, to go from here to here, or do we want to route them up and around to go, there? So we need to kind of know, what's going to be where and when, ahead of time. The next thing is putting in all the NPCs or non-player characters. So these are not enemies. These are going to be, everything, everyone in the game that's going to be there and be around. These could be interactive or non-interactive type characters. So these could be just guys that are driving cars around or riding horses or walking around, whatever that is. But there's a bunch of stuff, there related to that. And then the next thing, which is related to NPCs, is placing the vendors, the stuff for crafting, the stuff for trainers. So these are helpers that are basically NPCs or a persona in the game that gives you value, that does something for you, right? And so an NPC here might be giving value in NPC here may be giving value in like giving you quests or giving you equipment or things like that. But these guys are the more specifics. They're going to do something for you, right? And next is kind of starting to figure out the items and the economics of these things. What are these things? How much do they cost? Where are they located? Which regions are they going to be in? What's available to buy from each vendor? Are those lists dynamic? Are those lists designed by the designers and controlled by the designers, right? And that's a really important decision because, if you start somebody off in a really bad way and it takes them too long to get up to speed to be cool, that can be a challenge. And so, you want to make sure that you have the ability to get them into trainers, get them into vendors and these things early enough, and that the costs are low enough. So a lot of costs need to be these bell curves, right? Where stuff starts off really cheap and then just, gets exponentially more expensive. But you want to have a system where you're breaking people into the game, and you're bringing them in slowly into the game. And so the economics behind that are going to be really, really, really important, especially if you're building like strategy games and stuff like that, where, if I want to do a Zerg rush, like I need to know, up front that I'm going to try that tactic, and that tactic may ultimately cause me to lose really badly. But, it's still an important part of the overall process, right? And then, we're going to start placing some basic cutscenes. We're going to start putting in where the bosses are, start putting in resources. In our particular case, we had portal gateways. These were like fast, rapid transit stuff that lets you teleport from one location to the next, in between different regions. We had different types of special events that could go on within each region. That could be maybe two different factions were fighting, and maybe that has nothing to do with the player, but the player comes in an area, there's a big battle going on, and maybe he has to avoid it, maybe he has to go help or whatever, but there could be a special, event that needs to be all kind of custom scripted or partially custom scripted or have AI added to it, that kind of stuff. And then lastly was placing hazards in the worlds. These would be, anything like a trap or a spike pit or fire, lava, acid pools, things like that. Stuff that would hurt the player if he touches it typically. So then we got to go in and do the construction approvals. You've got to figure out, what what you built, is it okay? Again, with your lead, it could be your level lead, it could be the chief creative officer or creative director or whatever. So you have to kind of figure out like, who has to approve things and when and where, right? And then you're going to add in some, because this is an MMORPG, and this is what would differ probably for your games, since not a lot of people make these games these days, but tying all the zones together, and then adding in the secondary gameplay as well is really important. And then in MMORPGs, there's a lot of stuff from like PvP that needs to be accounted for, as well as in this particular case, we were maxing out at level 60. So day one, basically your character would go from level 1 to level 60, and at level 60 you cap. And World of Warcraft did a similar thing, and they eventually raised their level caps to 100 and something. I think they're like 180 or something now. But that all happened over time. I believe WoW was originally at 60. And but what happens is people finish the core content in an MMO, and then they need to have more to do. And so they want to go back and revisit these levels and go back and do these levels over and over again. So you need to make sure there's like replayable high level content because anybody that gets to level 60 or gets to your level max, your level cap, gets to know what we call in-game mode. And in-game mode is actually can sometimes be the most lucrative modes, because that somebody's hooked. If somebody's going to play your game basically to the end, at that point, those people are pretty hooked on your game. And so quite often they could be whales as well. And so you definitely don't want to ignore them. And but it's a slippery slope on like how to get them what they want, but also not break the game. And so you have to have then content that could be maybe within the same levels. So again, because we have restraints on how many of everything we can make. So then we have stuff where you're going to go back and revisit a level, but now if you're level 60, you can go back in and play it again. Now, give you an idea or something of like we came up with in one of the games I was doing a fairly innovative way of doing this, and it was a way that high level players could play a game, and lower level players could play in the same world, the same space, and not be affected by it. And I thought it was kind of a cool, ingenious method for this that happened to work within our IP. But we had the idea that when you reach level 60 or when you reach max level, you would actually get and be able to buy or get a new set of goggles that would allow you to see ghosts. And so what you'll find out is basically you kind of get halfway through the game, or whatever you want to say. You get some way through the game. You get to level 60. You think that it's kind of like, okay, now I'm going to my end game. Now I'm going to keep grinding or whatever. But the way we added new content was you now equip these goggles, and these goggles now let you see a whole new side of the world. And so all we did for enemies now was when you were level 60 and had those goggles on, we spawned a whole bunch of enemies around you that were like the same exact enemies. They were the same models and the same things before, but now they're ghosts. And so we had ghost versions of every one of our models. And when I put those goggles on, I now had the ability to see, and then I would also gain weapons that were good against the ghosts. And so I had to have the right weapon and the right, I'd be able to see them and I'd be able to fight them, right? And so now 100% of the entire level was exactly the same. The level designers did not have to tweak anything. Sometimes they did, but they didn't have to. And players could basically go back in and double or triple their gameplay because now the same levels, had a whole new set of enemies in them and a whole new set of things. And, and there was doors and all the stuff that could be accessed through this second world that was all added, through this idea that there was this, ghost world, there. And so I thought that was a great solution where we were able to reuse all of our art, reuse all of our stuff, and provide all this level 60 plus content for not no cost, but pretty cheap. Right? Because we basically were just setting the transparency of a character. We were adding some visual effects to it. It had a little bit of a blur and a little bit of a weird ghosty kind of, apparition behind it, but that was done through an effect. And then because they were actually technically a different model and a different name, we could have different stats on them. And so there was a whole series then of ghost stats and those ghosts could then be, so the original, say, character could be, say, level 5 or 10, but we could have the ghost version, which could be level 50 or 60, and be way tougher, and have more powers and abilities. We could even give ghosts like, ability to like blast you with psionics and other things. So the ghosts kind of gain magic, as well as kind of a secondary thing. But again, this was almost free for us because we had all the animations, we had all the characters, we had everything there, and we just were able to put it into the game and basically, again, double our gameplay in our zones just by this one step here. But again, it took a creative way, a creative solution there to do that. So a little bit of an off topic, but for those of you that know me, I like to tell stories. I hope you guys like to hear them because I think it's interesting to see how we come up with design decisions, sometimes to solve problems. And as a game designer especially, and even as an artist and even as an engineer, you have to solve problems because we're never going to be able to like do this perfectly. We're never going to be able to like, oh yeah, I can make this game exactly the way I want it every time. Like that world does not exist. Maybe if you're a Valve or maybe you're at a few unicorn companies that have unlimited time and money, but most of us have to work within budgets and schedules and resource limitations and technical limitations and all these kinds of things. And so we're constantly looking for ways to do games faster and cheaper, right? And so these are, but by thinking through and understanding your restrictions, and if you don't understand that, like in this particular case, I needed to have level 60 gameplay. Like I understood this by, day one, that this was something I needed. And so it was something that I worked into my IP very, very, very early in it to know that I needed this thing there, right? And it worked out really well, and it was pretty fun. So there can be lots of ways, another example of this could be like a thing, enemies turn into zombies after you kill them. So now you got to fight him twice. You think you put him down and then he comes back because he comes back as a zombie, and then, maybe the zombie comes back with even more powers. If you kill the zombie or whatever, he comes back as a magical zombie or whatever, right? And so it's how do you do that? So now we're going to get into the level or zone terrain artwork pipeline. So again, for those of you that are artists, this is going to be something that's really important. But this is a gray area between a level designer and a level artist. And so depending on the team, depending on who you are and what you are, this pipeline can vary a lot. And so sometimes this is done by an artist, sometimes done by a designer. This could be a first pass could be done by a designer, and then a follow-up pass could be done by an artist. So there's a lot of different ways, again, that this can happen. But the first thing is just figuring out, how long is this supposed to take? You need to know, like, do I have 30 days to do this? Do I have 3 hours to do this? Right? It's really important that you understand and define your schedules, right? And so the first thing you're typically going to do, and this is for us in our particular level, because we were predominantly in an exterior game, predominantly had exterior levels. We did have some interiors, but in this particular case, this is the terrain artwork, right? And so we're worried about how the exterior terrain's working. So we had a custom engine, that we were using, and so our particular artists and designers would first sculpt that terrain, and then they would have to lay out the roads. If you don't know, roads are kind of a special case in most game engines, because roads have to like follow the terrain. They have to go like in and around things, and they might go from like one region to another, and they need to kind of look distinct. Like you need to know that there's a road there. But if it's always like really hard edges, if it always is just these like perfectly like rigid edges, then it also kind of doesn't blend well, and it looks fake, right? And then real roads and real things don't just sit flat on the terrain. Like they might actually be like depressed a little bit, or they might need bridges. Like if you had a train that goes, and there's a big dip in it, right? That road doesn't want to go like this. You want that road to go flat across with a bridge or something, right? You don't want to go down to a big gorge. So how do you create roads with bridges and like all these kinds of things? And so roads and rivers and really long things that snake across a terrain are usually very difficult. Unity and Unreal and a lot of the engines now can deal with those quite a bit better. And there's plugins and stuff that can deal with roads. But roads, just so you know, quite often are kind of special case. And they often have a little bit of a nuance in how they work. And often that's also true because they may have AI that's also working on them. Like, it's not just the player knowing there's a road there and a path there, but, depending on the kind of game you're building, AI may need to know that's a road. AI may need to know that they can drive down that road, so on and so forth, right? So roads can be very important. And figuring out, where is your town's going to be? Where is your building's going to be? You may not have those yet, but you might be white boxing these in, or clearing off a flat space, or figuring out where your buildings are going to be, right? And then, you're going to start roughing out the terrain textures and working on the terrain stuff. So basically here you're building out the entirety of the flat or hilly or whatever terrain you're building, right? And again, in our particular engine, this was fairly straightforward and used in our level editor. Now there could be some additional steps. Some games might have a lot more modular tiles that they'll use within their terrain. So they might have a couple steps in here to create these tiles, like cliffs, for example. So if you got a flat static mesh that you're going to go in and sculpt, and it's like clay, right? And you're going to push and pull, and you're going to mold it so it's got hills and things like that. The problem is you quite often take a texture and you plop a single texture down on top of it that goes across this thing. So if you have something that's like a hard edge and a hard cliff that goes way down, or even if it's just a couple meters, but as soon as there's something that's vertical, that texture tears across it because the texture is being projected down on it, and it doesn't know how to deal with these flat faces, right? And so that's another one of these problems that your engine has to deal with. And so the way some teams solve that is by having 3D models of like cliffs or things like that, or rocks or boulders, and then wherever you've got like a big flat face of something, you might plop a bunch of these like cliff models and you push them together and there, so the whole cliff face looks like it's a bunch of like custom rocks that really look like cliffs, versus looking like somebody pulled down a piece of mesh and it got textured poorly and things like that. So you probably know what I'm talking about. You've probably seen that in some games where the texturing just looks horrible on cliffs or on some edges, because they obviously had projected a single texture down on top of a flat mesh, and it didn't know how to compensate for faces that went at certain angles. In some terrain editors too, just as a side note, there's a lot of terrain tools now. If you're working in Unity, Unreal, or whatever, there's a lot of some pretty amazing terrain tools actually that can create, especially if you're creating realistic terrains, that can do these things, a lot of these steps for you. They can even take in like USGS data and other like real world data and create maps based on real places. But they can even do like elevation stuff where they can say like, okay, the hills and stuff at sea level, say at 0, start off at one texture. And as you go up and you go up and you go up, that texture can go, and you define this as a designer, or just define it in the tools to say like, hey, as I go up, it's going to go to like at the very top, like snowy mountains, and here is more rocky, and here is like chaparral, and here is like dense forest, and down here is like desert, right? So even you as a designer may not even have to necessarily like texture the terrain. The terrain may be semi-intelligent in the sense that its own texturing system is going to texture stuff based on the height and elevation, as well as potentially the slope angle. And so some of the tools do that as well now, where you kind of can sculpt things for the most part, and then the system has rules that it follows when it's creating these things. And so again, in today's landscape world, this process could vary quite a bit. The tools have definitely, since I wrote this, have improved exponentially. So again, look for and figure out what your process is going to be for this, because again, my process for my team with my crude tools back then, this is what we did, right? The next thing is getting into, again, we're going to start placing all the buildings, all the structures, objects, start adjusting like time of day and lighting. Now, you might have a world light that's a sun that's going around and changing dynamically. You might have fixed times. You got to figure out, is this level always going to be at the same time, or again, is it changing? or is the changing dynamic, or is it changing just like based on some other factor? This gets harder in MMORPGs. It's a little bit more straightforward in like a single player game, because in a single player game you can kind of control and know like, okay, I'm going to be coming back to this level to do some quest, and I know that some time has passed, so I can now make it nighttime to make it cooler, or whatever. But in an MMORPG, you might have 100 people or 1 million people in your level, and they may just be standing around talking, and is it just going to be daytime the whole time? And then if one guy leaves and he comes back, like, is it still daytime or is it now nighttime? Like, I mean, it just, you have to have consistency there. And so usually you have a 24-hour type clock. Now that 24-hour clock and that sun movement does usually, it can. I've actually seen games where it correlates to your real world, or some real world time clock somewhere. But it doesn't, they're usually hyper accelerated. So it might be that 24 hours of game time is really, say, 4 hours of real world time. So, if it's noon right now, 4 hours from now, it'll be noon again, right? And so the sun will go from, basically in 2 hours, it'll be pitch black and it'll be midnight, right? And then 2 more hours after that, it'll be, noon again, right? With full sun. And you'll get dusk and dawn and that kind of thing. And so the time and the light setups and stuff like that, this is something that's important, because it impacts visuals, but it can also be something that impacts other parts of the game, right? And so it could be something that impacts gameplay or other kinds of stuff, because the game might change, like the NPCs that are coming out at night, and things like that. So anyways, moving along, you got to set up all the weather and and the effects and just everything else in the level. Any animations that are going to be in the level. These could be part of a building. These could be part of the world, like waterfalls or things like that. You might have things that are triggerable, like a rock slide or something that might come down. So there could be all kinds of different effects and animations and things that could be placed. And these will be varied depending on if it's an MMO and, in a real world thing versus a single player game. So some of these things might be one-offs that only happen once and they affect something permanently. These could be something that maybe have to reset, and stuff. So there could be a lot of rules and things there to it. And then, again, adjusting for performance and making sure that it all works well, and then going through that approval process and making sure that, everybody's on board with it. And then one thing then now that you're going to go in and do in most games, and again, this can vary by engine. This is starting to change sometimes. I think collision is getting better for some games, in some engines, but especially back when the collision for where a player could move to or where a NPC could move to were often different things. And those did not always directly correlate to the actual game geometry. And so there was times where we would block off an area where, you try to avoid this, but there's times where like you don't want players like going someplace, right? So you might put up an invisible wall basically that the player can't see. And if the player tries to move there, he just stops and he's going to hit his head against it and he can't go there, right? And so sometimes that's done just to keep players out of things. Sometimes it's done very subtly. Just like if you had a wall that was like maybe had a little bit of a gap in it, kind of thing, and the player might be able to walk into it and just get slightly in here, and then the camera gets weird, and like the camera gets kind of stuck, or the player could get kind of stuck because it got too narrow and he's into a tighter space. And so you, as a level designer or as an artist, might go in and put a piece of collision right here. So now there's this gap, but there's collision now blocking it. So the player, if he tries to push into that little thing, actually can't. So visually it looks like there's a bit of a gap in there, but but physically he can't go into that gap. So there's stuff like that. A lot of collision gets put in to fix bugs or problems, maybe keep you from falling off a cliff that we don't want you to fall off of, or whatever that is. But quite often we go in and manually update collision on a world map, just to solve a wide variety of gameplay problems or different bugs, stuff like that. And then usually you want to run through and check the whole zone, making sure there's nothing visually wrong with it. This is kind of that first level of like bug testing, and things, and just kind of knowing, what's the game looking like, right? And what, and is everything okay? And then again, reminding people to back it all up. So now let's talk about objects. Now, we talked earlier on about just from a high level what the objects were in a game, but this is really talking about how do you generate objects? How do you create the basic object? In this particular case, we had an optional step here. That a lot of our objects, especially in an MMO, were upgradable. And so the objects, we had to know kind of what the upgrade path was. Was the same base object going to change? Did the object maybe change through tint and color? Did the name change, or what happened if this object leveled up or whatever? And that could be a particular character, it could be a particular object, or whatever it was. But we needed to know what the rules were for these things, because it definitely was a lot different, or is a lot different for everybody, right? And so then we want to validate that the design for this object is good. And then before we start making the object, we want to again make sure there's the tasks for it. We need to figure out what's needed for this object, what are its requirements, how many LODs. Again, level of detail, if you guys don't know, is quite often you have your main object, and then you have different lower resolution versions of it. So if your main object, let's say, is 10,000 polygons, you might have 2 or 3 or 5 versions that might go from 10,000 to 5,000 to 2,500, all the way down to 50. And so if an object is a mile away and it's just barely a silhouette, that object might only be a couple polygons. It might even just be a texture at that distance. That you just see there's a little bit of movement. We see there's something there, and as that thing gets closer and closer and closer to us, it'll go to higher resolutions. But you're doing that because it just the game engines typically aren't fast enough. And this is changing. PS5s and things like that are getting faster. So some of this need for LODs is being reduced, but that's still there, especially in mobile and other stuff. And this is about keeping the performance of your game. And this could be for 3D models, for textures. The same thing, like, you could have a 4K texture on something that's really close. And then as the thing pulls back, the texture is going to go to 640 by 480 or some really low resolution. And what you have to try to do is avoid what's called popping. So when an LOD, at each one of these stages, which could be distance-based or could be triggered on different events or whatever that is, sometimes when you switch from one to another, it can happen so fast and be so dramatic that it pops. And you'll see that in the game where suddenly a character, like sometimes even will go back and forth like this, and you see it like pop, 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 pop as it goes from high to low or whatever. And that's like the worst thing ever, and you really want to avoid that, in these LODs. But that's what's happening there, is that these are performance things that the game is trying to compensate for, but somebody didn't do a great job at controlling the LODs, or that they're too different. Another thing that'll happen in a lot of LODs is, especially like for characters or things, as I get really close to a particular character, I might have the option of turning on facial animation. And also, like in an early character, like for really low resolution, my hands might be like this, and they don't move, they don't animate, they're like that. And then as I get to like a medium distance, I might have this, and so then I might see like this happening, and I might be able to do that. But again, these are like, all these 4 fingers are one, and this is one, kind of thing. And then as I got really close, then suddenly I've got, full hands. And as I got really close, my face gets fully animated. But as I get a little farther away, the facial animation turns off, or facial animation can go to textures. So if you don't know about LODs, that's what that level of detail is about. So, but again, this is all about performance. And, this is also, figuring out what other stuff is needed, for the game, figuring out what, does it have effects on it? Does it have audio on it? That kind of stuff. And then from a game designer's perspective, starting to put these objects in the game, putting all the stats and things in there, what are the stats for the objects? What are the costs for them? Where are they available? All that kind of stuff. So these things are ready to go into the game. And typically that's in a database. And that database is usually something that, once that object's placed in the game, I can very easily, go in and change that database, right? And really make sure that it's easy for me to change all the stats and rebalance the game anytime. And then you're gonna, if it's a weapon or something, you're gonna work on its projectile effects. Does it have like recoil? Does it shoot out bullets? Does it have muzzle flash? Does it, is it a laser that shoots out? Like, what are the weapons and effects that are there? Does it have audio that's happening? What engineering and stuff needs to happen. So this is basically getting this whole thing ready for engineering to work. And this is just really roughly, you're going to go for, if you're building an object, you also have another step of the concept art for it, and you're going to generate the rough concept art sketch. You're going to validate that sketch. Then you're going to do detailed sketches, and these are things where the concept art, if you guys don't know, is usually done from just kind of some perspective angle. But that angle, it's always hard to tell exactly how big everything is and stuff. So in order for a 3D modeler to take a piece of concept art and, in the best case possible, model that accurately, not every team does this. Not every team does this step, but it is very useful. Is you create perspectives. So you create like a side view, top view, back view, whatever is needed, and you create those from a very like straight on camera kind of perspective, not from a perspective, so that everybody knows exactly how big everything is and what the details are from an exact like say side view, and then a modeler can bring in that thing into their 3D package and really use that sketch to model from. It saves a lot of time, a lot of effort there. So, now we're talking about just the general object, pipeline flow chart, of how are we going to, concept something and get it approved, tasking it and going out to, again, the concept of it. So we've kind of gone back on this particular flow chart a little bit mile high, with it, creating all the modeling diagrams, creating all the assets, from the models, the textures, all the variants, the LODs, again, we talked about this in the beginning, checking the asset names and file locations. Did you put all the assets in the right places? Did you name them the right things? Did you check and double check, the polygon counts, the texture sizes, and things like that? I was on a quick story. I was on a project one time, and the team was working on this Die Hard game, and they were having a lot of performance issues on their game, and they couldn't figure out why. It was a first-person shooter. They couldn't figure out why it was running so slow, and for weeks they were trying to figure out why the game ran so slow, and they couldn't figure it out. I finally flew out to the developer. I sat down with them, and in probably 30 seconds, I looked at this one model, and I was like, it was a trash can. And I said, how many polygons are in that trash can? And one of the artists pulls it up, and he's like, oh, about 10 million. And I just started laughing. And I was like, that trash can should have been about 100 polygons, and it was 10 million. And so whoever had done that had no experience. It was a junior guy. He didn't know that these things had restrictions on poly counts and stuff. And so they had placed a bunch of these trash cans throughout the level. So they literally had hundreds of millions of polygons trying to be drawn, in a time when they probably should have only had a couple million polygons being drawn. So they were literally 100x over the poly counts of their system, and that's why it was bogging down so much. But they didn't. It was such a small asset, nobody thought to check it. To know that one asset was way too expensive. So you need to set limitations. You need to say okay, we're going to have X number of models, and they're going to have, certain restrictions on poly counts and size of textures and, all those kinds of things. So again, that your game runs and the performance runs well. Same thing with your assets for your characters and the complexities of your skeleton, and number of animations, all these things, all are things you have to understand and define, in this pipeline before you get started. Otherwise, it's really easy to do it. This same team, for example, before I did this, one of the reasons I did this was we had 122 characters in our game, and I had made it pretty clear that we only were going to have 4 body types, and we were only going to have 4 skeletal meshes, 4 different types of skeletons, and and 4 sets of animations. So each set was maybe 100 animations, but that was like 400 animations altogether for the whole game, 100 for each body type, and that was all there was for the whole game. And I went away, came back from China, went to the U.S. for a while, came back to China, and we realized that they had created 122 separate models, 122 separate skeletons. Each of those had 100 animations. So now there was 122 times 100, so 122,000 or whatever, 12,000 animations in the game. And everything was unique. And we were literally like 100x or whatever, or at least 25x over memory, just because they didn't know what their limitations were, or they had forgotten and not paid attention. And so that was a perfect case of we wasted months of work and stuff, all because they didn't understand that technical limitation. And so that's why establishing and understanding these processes is very useful to you, because again, if you don't have this stuff established, it's very easy to do it wrong, right? And so it's very easy to miss a step. It's very easy to skip something, and to know that like, oh wait, we didn't add audio. Oh wait, we didn't do this. So again, these are these checklists that I can go down when I'm making something, whether you're a producer or whether you're an artist or a designer or whatever, you can kind of know where in this pipeline do I need to do something? Where in this pipeline do I have a job to do, and when am I going to do it? And I can track these things through the schedule and know my dependencies and these things. And so this is what really helps your project move a lot smoother. So you guys aren't being too chatty today. Please ask some questions. I know I'm kind of moving a little bit fast, but please feel free to again ask questions, and happy to answer any questions you guys might have. But hopefully this is being useful, for everybody. But again, please don't feel free to ask stupid questions, because I want you guys to understand this stuff and really get what I'm talking about the best I can. So again, there's a lot here to kind of absorb. There's a lot of different steps involved, but I hope this will help you guys in kind of understanding again the processes that go into making these games. So let's talk about characters. So characters are, some of the more complicated things in the games. You've got to go in from a design perspective and go in and do a lot of design work to figure out what are all the things they're going to do, what are they going to interact with, what are their abilities, skills, stories, what are they going to look like, all these kinds of things, right? And then you got to go in and concept them and then figure out from an arts perspective, okay, what are they going to do? Now, in this particular case, all of our characters had reusable armor and shared weapons. And so this was actually a little bit of a different pipeline than some games that have, where, if you're going to go and make God of War and you're going to make Kratos or somebody, like, he might have some interchangeable weapons, but like maybe they're only used by him, and he might have a couple different outfits, but only he wears them, right? And that's a very different thing, because he's kind of a signature, really main character, right? And that's a very different process than create a whole bunch of generic stuff that everybody and everything in the game, for the most part, can reuse. And so we might have a couple unique assets here and there for a key villain or a key hero or a key NPC, but the vast majority of probably 90-95% of all of our art was reused across many different things. And so that was important for us to kind of understand. So again, just, there's lots and lots of steps here that are, involved. And then you're going to have to go into, setting up the character. Now, we have a system called CAP, or Create a Player System. And you'll see this in a lot of games where, you can change out different faces. Maybe you can change the face, make it fatter, make it skinnier, change the skin color, change your hair, change your eyes, change the body type, all these kinds of things. And so we had to have all these rules because we had a Create a Player System where characters, the players could create their own characters, right? And so we had to be able to, have a lot of rules to make sure that every piece of armor, because, the player characters went through like, at least, I can't remember, I think we had 60 levels, and I think we had new sets of armor every 5 levels or 10 levels. So I don't know, we had at least 10 sets of armor at each level that you could get. So, and then every character class had different armor. So we had hundreds and thousands of different pieces of armor that all had to be able to snap onto the same characters, right? So you had to set up a lot of rules and pipelines to do all this. And again, that's why we had a lot of like skeletal and animation reuses and things like that. So all this had to be really heavily tested early on as well to really make sure that it all worked together, because this cap system was very complicated. And it's definitely a system that is a challenge for a lot of people to make. And then once that system's kind of validated, then, you had to come in here and create all those assets, and create, all those thousands of different assets that could have different varieties and different things, different color tints. So we might have two pieces of armor, for example. You might have the black armor and the red armor. And I'm using generic names, but the red armor could be the fire armor, and the black armor could be the Black Knight's armor, or whatever it is. And they're the same exact piece of art with just a color tint on them, and then maybe a shader change, and then maybe like an effect change. So maybe the fire armor has a little bit of fire on it or something. Just saying. But the base model is exactly the same. And if that base model ever gets changed, then it replicates out throughout all of them with just some programming type changes, meaning the color tint might got changed. That effect is still working on it. Things like that. So again, you have to set up a lot of rules. You have to set up a lot of stuff here, and you have to really understand, who can wear these things. Are these things tied to certain character classes? All that kind of stuff. All these different variations, and names and stat differences and stuff like that. And so you can get a lot in a game if you reuse things, right? And so that's important for you to kind of understand. And then again, how does it all animate? Is it a static piece of, is it like a shield or a piece of armor, like a helmet that really doesn't animate, it doesn't move? Or is it a helmet with a bunch of plumage and things that it's going to animate in the wind and do all this kind of thing, right? And does that, how is that animation going to work? Is that a skull system? Is that done through a different type of animation system? And that kind of stuff, right? And things. So there's lots of different things here in validating all of your player characters and all of your NPCs. And so the players and NPCs were using a lot of the same stuff. And so this was important to kind of understand. And then we're going to get into like the NPC pipeline flowcharts. And this is basically, again, very similar to the player characters, but these are all the non-player characters, figuring out through very similar processes, who are all these non-player characters, what roles they do, like what are they, are they going to be, a vendor? Are they going to be somebody you fight, an enemy? Are they going to be somebody that sells you things? Are they going to be somebody that trains you? Are they going to be a named character that's really important in a cutscene? Or are they just somebody generic, peasant 1, peasant 2 kind of thing? What are these things in the game, right? And so defining all of these things. And then, so again, the note here is that, again, most of these guys are using the same stuff that the player characters are using, but we did allow for that some customization, some unique things might be needed. You want to have a couple unique, memorable things in the game, whether those are characters or vehicles or weapons or whatever. I mean, if everything is 100% shared, it's not as cool, right? So always account for, at least 80 or 90% should be reused if you're really trying to maximize it. But you want that 10 or 20% at least that's just kind of like, oh, wow, I haven't seen that before, right? And maybe that's something you'll get to use later. And maybe it's just something that's unique and signature for that particular guy that makes them memorable, especially if you see them on the battlefield or something. So again, these are, all the different steps that we went into, that we have to figure out how to, again, how do we set up all of our characters? How do we set up the clothing? How do we set up NPCs? And how do we, if we need to, how do we set that up to be consistent so that we got the same NPCs? Like, do we randomize it or are we getting the same NPCs every time, everywhere? That kind of thing, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And then, again, like with weapons, their skills and abilities, like, does an NPC have, a level to him? If this is going to be an enemy that I'm going to fight, like if he's a level 20 enemy versus a level 50 enemy, how does that work? How is that stats going to work? Is there a multiplier there? There's a lot of stuff from a game design perspective that you got to figure out that's also going to have impact on the weapons, the armor, things like that, because again, you're setting rules. So you want to know that, like, this is level 50 armor. And if you had a character that was, say, level 10 wearing a level 50 piece of armor, it'd be really confusing, and vice versa. If you have a level 50 character who's wearing a level, what players recognize as level 10 armor, he's going to go up there thinking like, hey, I can kill this guy really easily. He's only like a level 10-ish character, and then suddenly he dies, and he's like, what happened? Because it doesn't realize that this character was wearing armor that was designed, that the player began to recognize as lower level armor, right? And so those are the kind of things, again, these rules really save you. These rules really help you in game design and in art and everything else, because we're setting up these rules of how things work, right? And so in game production, these rules and these pipelines are what save us, right? And these are what make us efficient. These are what allow us to get our jobs done, because without these rules, we'd be in a lot of trouble, right? And so, you need to really understand the pipeline, at least for what your job does, and who's involved, who gets passed, what are you supposed to do, and really make sure, especially if you're new in the industry, like, understand what is this pipeline, what is this process that you're going to go through, right? And and so again, adding in the character all the final stuff, all these final details, and this polish, and then getting into testing it and making sure that they all work, making sure that everything's optimized. And this is a huge task. Like, characters in, these kinds of games are a massive part of the game, right? And they're really complicated because they got AI and animation and effects and lots of different levels and stats and complexities and, behaviors and, all sorts of stuff. Especially, and I don't care whether you're doing a first-person shooter or you're doing an MMO or anything in between, the characters are probably going to be one of the more complicated things, in the game. Now, we had the concept of monsters as well. Monsters were basically NPCs that had slightly different rules. These were non-humanoids, so these did not, share the armor, but they did have some reusable stuff, meaning there was categories and classes of monsters. But again, they were their own types here and had their own AI, had their own attacks, their own animations, things like that. So these were built in a kind of similar way to the NPCs in a similar pipeline, but they were a little simpler. And they also were designed quite often to be a little bit lower in complexity, so you could have more of them, things like that. But you can see that we had some different skeletal types, quadrupeds, birds, snakes, spiders, fish, others. So some of these were things that you again would just see as part of that natural living world. But we're not necessarily didn't necessarily have to be an enemy per se, right? A quadruped, if you don't know, is like a horse, a dog, things like that. So four-legged things. So and again, making sure it's all named right, making sure that it's all there. So these flow charts were really designed again as checklists to say, here's what you're going to do, here's how you're doing it, that kind of thing, right? So it's important that you understand that this thing can really save your butt sometimes when you're working on a game with new employees or people again that are overseas or don't know what you're doing. So monster creation, this is setting them all up, setting up their databases, setting up all their stats, their textures, color variants, putting it all together, and again just making it all work. Right, and this was an important part of this whole thing. So again, very similar to NPCs, but just knowing that everything, again, characters or anything that has a skeletal system, has animations, has AI, all these things has a lot of complexity to them. And again, testing these things out. Now let's get into quests, and we'll talk about a whole different type of thing. So this is, you've built your level, and you're going to start making quests, and you're going to come in here and you're going to concept the quests. And you're going to, paper design them. You're going to, get some approvals. You're going to, figure out how is a quest going to work across multiple zones, multiple areas, and stuff. So then you're going to move into like detailing a quest, and you're going to, figure out, the 2D maps. You're going to figure out, the world terrain, the quest stories, the cutscenes, NPC designs. You can see each of these has their own pipelines, right? So those are things that are important for you to kind of figure out you know, each of themselves, and just everything that goes into kind of making a quest. And then there's the quest production. How does a quest actually get implemented now? And how do you do it? And how are you going to build it? And what are you going to use to implement it, verify it? Make sure you're getting rewards, make sure you're testing it, and playing it. So you can see that it's fairly complicated. And then we got into this whole subchart of quest concepting. So again, this was up here where we're going to get into concepting the quests. So you can see here, this quest concept is now this step. So this is kind of how this was flowing together. And again, you're seeing kind of one aspect of it, but this is just kind of one thing. But you can see that this is fairly complicated. And that this was there for the designers to kind of have a cheat sheet, a little bit of kind of like, what are they trying to answer, the who, what, where, when, and how kind of things. And these weren't all of those there, but I put these in there just to help remind the quest designers of what do they need to understand each one of these quests. What are they trying to do when they're concepting the quests? And, how are they going to work within the zones and, and everything else. So you can see that like quests are pretty sophisticated. Quests have a lot of things in them, that they've got to figure out. The quest designers have a lot of stuff that they got to figure out while they're concepting these quests. And then again, just making sure that they're getting integrated and built into the game. And then now they're going to go in and develop the quest. And so how they actually build a quest step by step, and they're going to put the quest givers in. They're going to set up all the stories and stuff. They're going to set up all the targets and goals, adding a unique art that might appear. Like maybe a chest has to appear just for that particular quest. That's going to be like, go find this chest, and it's only going to appear for that player maybe, or for a time period, things like that. Thinking about, mobs, being groups again of enemies, bosses, other stuff. Those have their own sub things of how are the mobs, created, and what types of things. So for example, you might have a quest that, says, hey, you got to have, go kill, 20 wolves, in your game, but you have to make sure those 20 wolves are even there. Right. So what happens if the player like kills 10 of the wolves and the wolves don't respawn? And now the player starts a quest and the quest says kill 20, wolves, but there's only 10 left in the world. Now the player can only kill 10 and he'll never ever complete that quest, because 20 are not available. So there's a lot of stuff like that, like in quests that get tricky, where you're constantly having to make sure that the player is going to have everything they need, and this gets triply complicated in an MMORPG where another player might kill the wolf, right? And so now things might spawn, and in some games we're really bad about this, where they had like a spawner that would spawn, say, that wolf, and there would be like a line of people waiting to kill that wolf, and it was like the wolf would spawn, say, every minute. So the wolf would spawn, the first player would go over, kill it, he'd get it, and he'd get in the back of the line, and then the next player, the wolf would spawn, and the next player would kill that, and they would just sit there for like hours, all waiting their turn to like kill the next wolf. And it was like, oh my God, it was horrible game design. But that was the way a lot of MMOs did it, because there was only so many wolves in the world. The wolves only generated so fast. And if a bunch of people were all doing that same quest at the same time, they were all kind of stepping on each other's toes. So, getting in and scripting all the AI, scripting out all the behaviors, audio, all that kind of stuff. So again, very detailed, just, step by step by step, how are you going to do this? Now, for all of you animators out there, and people are doing, characters, your artists, this is definitely an artist job here of figuring out, how to build a skeleton, once your 3D model, once your mesh is built, how are you going to build that level, or how are you going to build that skeleton that's going to fit there, and how is it going to bend correctly? And so this is a fairly complicated job. This is definitely something that's a bit of a specialized job. So if you're just an animator, not all animators know how to rig, but rigging, and this is, the name for building this, the job of this is usually called a rigger. Now some animators are also riggers, and and if you're thinking about becoming an animator and you're not, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to also learn how to rig. I know animators who cannot rig, and it detriments their job a lot, because all they they know great like how to make somebody move and how to make their joints flex, and they can make it look really natural. They can make this stuff there, but they don't know the technical side, and so they don't know how to like set up a character who's in a T pose and how to put a skeleton inside and how to set it all up and how to set restraints. So like it's not even as easy necessarily as just setting up a basic skeleton. Like you actually want to often set up like range of motion. So like you might say like, okay, well I can set my arm up to here, but I can't, like rotate my arm like back, like this, because if I can, it's going to look weird, right? And so you might, as a rigger, you might even set restraints and stuff that just says like, here's your limitations, here's your range of motion. Like this arm can go to here, but it can't go to here, right? And so an animator can animate it from here to here, but once it hits here, it stops, right? So a really good rigger will know how to limit the models, know how the human range of motion really works, and set limitations and stuff. So the rigging job can be pretty complicated. And the guys that can really build these really great rigs are kind of few and far between. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of guys out there that can kind of do it, but the guys that are really masters at it are amazing. And this gets even more complicated when you get into facial and hands, cloth, stuff like that. But setting up kind of and validating the basic skeleton is really important. And then the part of skinning the model, that's attaching that skeletal system to the actual 3D mesh of the 3D model of the character, so that now when I move my mesh, everything moves along with it. So that's a whole other topic for another day about what character animation's about. But it's very complicated. And then you have to get into just making all the animations and figuring out what am I going to move, how am I going to move. Like sometimes you can make it all up. Sometimes it has to be very accurate. Like I did a TNA wrestling game, and every animation was motion captured. Everything came from and had to be super realistic. Like we had to know how to come in and do a particular jump or do a particular attack, that kind of thing. And so that was really important for us to get right and figure out and things. And so this could be hand animated, it could be motion captured, or some combination thereof. But you got to get all the animations into the game. Next is all the cutscenes. Like you got to get the cutscenes in the game, and every time. And these could be super elaborate cutscenes. These could be pre-rendered. These could be in-game. These could be little short cutscenes that are just part of a quest. These could be very, very elaborate cutscenes that are interstitials between regions of the game or whatever, right? These could be done in the game engine. These could be done in a lot of different ways, and so but you have a whole pipeline just for how to get the camera angles, how to get the camera shots, the timing for everything, and all that kind of stuff. So cutscenes are also really complex. This is about all the special effects, like how you're going to put the effects in the game, and starting to pipe get a really basic pipeline for the special effects that are in the game. How is the audio assets going to get created? And so audio is an important part of the game, and so it's it's its own, again, subspecialty there. And audio is tough because you have to have the right assets, but you also have to have like those assets tied to the gameplay. You have to have those tied to the assets. So like we were talking about, like you might have that chest that opens and creaks when it opens. It has to know when it's being triggered. Or it has to be, for example, say a footstep. A footstep as I'm walking across grass is one thing, and then as I walk across stone, then it's like thunk, 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 thunk versus ch-ch-ch-ch, and then I walk on metal and it's clank, 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 right? And so with footsteps, I might need to know, like, where is my character walking? What material is he currently walking on? And which sound do I play when, and those kinds of things, right? And so there's a lot of design that goes into audio, and depending on the kind of game you're making, audio can be kind of like, yeah, it's nice to have, to like absolutely critical to like the mood and the ambiance of the game. Audio, especially if you do like a horror game or something. Oh my God, like you gotta spend a lot of time here as a game designer and as audio directors and stuff, just because it's like you really want to set the mood a lot of times in audio, and we often don't as game designers or game developers. We just kind of see audio as just kind of like, we'll just add it in at the end. Like it's just it's like icing on the cake, that just kind of like adds a little bit of fluff and it makes it a little bit better. And that can be kind of true in some games. But a really, really good game is thinking about audio kind of day one, and really trying to figure out how to really get the most out of audio, and even dynamic audio, where the systems, if you're using Fmod or using certain audio tools, let you even create dynamic music. And that's a whole nother kind of pipeline where the music might change based on, stuff that's happening in the world. And we were doing this back even, I remember the second game I worked on, Armor Command. And so we were back, gosh, what year was this? 1992, 93, back in the very early days. And DOS-based, I believe that was still a DOS-based game. Even there we had a dynamic audio system where, you come in and get close to like enemies, and then the music would start picking up in intensity, and then as you got into battle, the music would totally change and be like super exciting and whatever while you were fighting. And then as soon as the battle like ended and you got away from the enemies, then the music would go back down again and go back to sort of like normal ambiance and whatever. And it really made the battles like so much more exciting, like just to know that it was picking up. But we were doing all that dynamically, and it wasn't like pre-scripted per se, right? It was scripted in the sense that we had lots of different pieces of music that could all like blend perfectly together, and the audio guys had to know what they were doing, because they had to know like, how does this blend into this, and how does this like transition to this, really smoothly. It's like a DJ, right? They can beat match this stuff and figure out all these things. And so there's again a whole different pipeline for like how is audio brought into the game, and stuff, and whether it's background music, whether it's sound effects, all those kind of things. Voiceover, in a game, there's a lot of different things that go into, making sure the audio is originally created, making sure it's compressed right, making sure it sounds good, making sure it can blend together, and things. And so if you've never worked with audio, it's definitely a lot more complicated than people realize, both from a programming side, from the audio creation side, the audio engineers, and things like that do a lot more than sometimes we realize, but they often do it in their own little black box world. And when they kind of just give us these things and it works, and the rest of us game developers just kind of go like, there's audio, it works. Like, like how hard was that kind of thing? And not realizing that there actually can be pretty big pipelines and detailed pipelines there, as well. And then, talking about, integration. And so, one of the things that happens is quite often we'll have different departments that create stuff. So like animators might create animations, and a character artist might create the character, and another prop artist creates a weapon, and somebody else creates a door, and somebody else creates something else, right? And then an AI programmer's creating some AI, and all these things ultimately all have to kind of come together at some point, right? And those are going to come together. Maybe, through a bunch of individuals. It might come through occasionally, like we have a tech artist or somebody who's also kind of those in-betweeners, because sometimes the artists are not the most technical savvy, and sometimes the engineers don't really understand art. And so there is occasionally on teams these kind of jack of all trade wizards that will help make sure that these pipelines are really smooth, because we often have trouble in integration when we try to take one thing and we try to take it, say, from Maya to Unreal, like, we go through FBX, we go through some file format thing, and something doesn't work, and like it just, the textures are off or whatever, and it's just like, all right, who's going to fix that? Who's going to help me with that? Who's going to help me integrate that into the game engine, into the game, and then you get it in there and you think that it's going to work, and it doesn't, right? And so that can be, a big challenge. And so, again, audio is an important part of this. And then, and then QA and testing and usability, focus testing, all this kind of stuff. I don't get into this in super detail in this pipeline process, but you need to have a full pipeline and process for QA, testing as well. And then, you also need to make sure that everything's being validated. Everything is being, checked to make sure that it's working, make sure that it's not breaking the game. So we often will have build servers and things that are actually like automating some of this now, where this is going through and being checked, and making sure just everything's working right. And so as things get integrated into the game, that nothing breaks it, nothing maybe got messed up, exported the wrong way. It could be through a bug or somebody did something wrong. But you see that all the time where somebody integrates something the wrong way. Suddenly the whole game blows up because the asset that should have been 1 megabyte in size suddenly was 1 gigabyte in size. And blows out your memory. And then people try to load the program. And it just literally blows up on you. And you just never know what's gonna cause it. I mean, and things can lots of things can happen. Lots of things can be buggy. And you have to kind of figure those out. And even in commercial releases and stuff like that. I mean, I was working in Unreal 4 today, even right before this, and I was working on some special effects through some plugins that I bought. And, I did something and it literally hard crashed Unreal, so it's still pretty common. Like, even on a commercially released thing, you're still going to have, quite often, these things happening. Anyways, and so you're going to be checking all these things, checking and double checking that everything's working. And then you're going to go into, instances. We talked about this a minute ago. So instances are a variant. So basically you have your original version, and then an instance is a copy basically of that. And an instance can be a perfect copy, or an instance can be a variation. So you could have like a perfect one-to-one match. So you could say like this instance is 100% exactly the same. So if this one changes and like we do this, then this one also does exactly that. And they're exact mirrors of each other. But then you can also have an instance that maybe mirrors over here, and the original version that's here is going to stay the same. But now the instance might say like, okay, well, we're going to do this now with this instance, but this one stays the same and this one doesn't. And if this one changes those fingers, this instance just kind of still stays the same because you told it like override basically, or maybe you changed this one to red and you flipped it around, but in the same hand, if you scaled this instance up and made it bigger, and suddenly now this instance is bigger, that if that wasn't locked in this instance, then this instance is also going to be bigger. So certain aspects, certain stats, certain things on an instance can be locked, certain things cannot be locked. So it really kind of varies. And so again, this is just the final kind of pipelines about how to set up instances of things and making sure those are working right. And getting into just kind of the last couple things here before we wrap up. But bosses as well, these have their own things, and these can be both the boss characters, the environments, the boss attacks, the boss animations. Everything about a boss can be custom. And so that's what you have to figure out, like how custom is the boss? Is the model himself unique? Is the AI unique? Is the animations unique? Is the world environment that the boss is in unique? Is his attacks and his weapons and all those kinds of things unique. So bosses can be super, super, super difficult and elaborate, and you have to be very careful. Bosses can be something that makes or breaks your game because of their complexities. Mounts are vehicles, or in our case, horses that allowed you that you could ride. And those things could be four-legged, they could be flying, they could be whatever. But we had certain restrictions because we needed a character to be able to climb up and ride the horse, right? And then ride along with it. So we now had to be able to link those together and put a player character onto a mount. The mount also, kind of like the player character, could be customized. And then they had to have shared animations. So when the player and the mounts combined, that actually created technically another model that was now had its own set of animations, so that now as I'm riding the horse, now the player has like ride the horse animations, and the horse is moving, the player is moving with it, but that was its own set of animations and stuff. So just a bunch of things like that were related to mounts that we had to set up and test those. And then consumable items were another types of things that we had that had a slightly different things. This was used for crafting. So consumables have a slightly different pipeline in their creation and how they were used. And so they had kind of their own little bit of pipeline that we were starting to define. So that's it. Sorry, it's pretty long. It's almost 30 pages of pipelines. So maybe not the most exciting thing in the world, but I hope you got something out of it. I hope this helped you a little bit just to kind of see and understand all these steps. Don't forget there's a link there to the original document if you guys want to check it out and look at it. Again, this is only going to work for my specific game, for my team, for my needs. This is not going to work for everybody, but I hope that it can help you, and understanding better about how a particular type of game was made, and how we were able to write up the process, and how we were able to define that as a team, and how we were able to define that so that the whole team was on the same page and didn't forget things, and and how that was going to work for us. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all for joining me today, and I hope to see you all next week. And otherwise, be safe and have a great week. So thanks again. Take care.